You were never meant to be a Mitchell, Paige. You were just a placeholder for the daughter I actually wanted, my mother Sarah whispered, her hand trembling with a strange, dark excitement as she slipped our family's heirloom sapphire ring onto my cousin Riley's finger instead of mine. I am Paige Mitchell. Standing there on the stage of the Mitchell Group's 30th anniversary gala, I felt 300 pairs of eyes on us, waiting for my collapse. But I did not give them a show. As a genetic counselor, I have spent my career looking at the cold, unyielding truth written in human blood, and I had already seen the map of their betrayal. They thought they had successfully swapped our lives 30 years ago and buried the secret in a shallow grave of lies. They did not know that I had already mapped the DNA of their conspiracy, and tonight, I was going to take back the name they stole from me. Before I show you how I dismantled their perfect family image, please like and subscribe, but only if you believe that blood never lies. And I always want to know where these stories are reaching people, so tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Now let me take you back to 3 weeks ago, to the day I opened the first envelope. I grew up in a house built of glass, steel, and pharmaceutical patents. The Mitchell name was synonymous with precision, and my mother Sarah was the high priestess of that altar. She was a woman who measured everything: the calories in our breakfast, the grade point averages on our report cards, and the exact distance she kept between herself and me. For 30 years I lived in a state of quiet, desperate endurance. I was the dutiful daughter, the one who studied until 4 in the morning, the one who earned a master's degree in genetic counseling to prove I was worthy of the Mitchell legacy. But no matter how many accolades I brought home, I was always treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Then there was Riley. My cousin Riley was everything I was not. She was vibrant, loud, and possessed a natural, effortless charm that made Sarah light up in a way I had never seen directed at me. We were born on the same humid Tuesday in August, 30 years ago, in the private maternity wing of Mitchell General Hospital. My mother and her sister Brenda had shared a suite. It was a legendary family story, a double miracle that was supposed to bind our two branches together forever. But as we grew, the lines between us became strange. Riley lived in the smaller house on the edge of the estate with Aunt Brenda, yet she spent every afternoon in our grand library with my mother. Sarah would brush Riley's hair, whispering secrets to her, while I sat in the corner invisible behind a mountain of textbooks. I used to think I was just the boring child, the one who lacked the Mitchell spark. I blamed myself for the coldness in my mother's eyes. I thought if I worked harder, if I became the best in my field, she would finally see me. My career as a genetic counselor was born from that void. I spent my days helping families understand their blueprints. I looked at the twisted ladders of DNA and saw the truth that people couldn't hide with expensive clothes or rehearsed smiles. Blood doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't lie to protect a reputation, it just exists. And for years I used that science to help others find their roots, never realizing that my own foundation was built on a bed of shifting sand. The doubt began 6 months ago, during a routine medical screening for the Mitchell Group's new executive insurance policy. As the senior genetic consultant for the firm, I was tasked with reviewing the family's health profiles. I had seen my mother blood type 1,000 times on medical forms, and I knew my late father's records by heart. He was a brilliant man who had died when I was 10, leaving behind a massive trust fund that was locked until my 30th birthday. I was sitting in my lab, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses, when I saw the anomaly. Riley's blood type was an impossibility if she were truly the biological daughter of Brenda and her late husband. It was a small detail, a minor scientific friction that most people would have ignored. But I am a Mitchell. I am trained to notice the smallest deviation in the code. I tried to tell myself it was a clerical error. I spent 2 weeks rechecking the files, convinced that I was overthinking a simple mistake. But then I looked at my own profile. I looked at the markers that should have linked me to Sarah. They weren't there. The more I dug, the more the world began to tilt. The inheritance laws of the Mitchell estate were ancient and ironclad. My grandfather had dictated that the majority of the fortune and the control of the labs could only pass to the direct biological offspring of the eldest child. That was Sarah. If I was Sarah's daughter, the empire was mine. If Riley was Sarah's daughter, it was hers. I didn't want the money, I wanted the truth. I needed to know why I had spent 3 decades feeling like a ghost in my own home. I began to collect samples in secret, a stray hair from my mother's vanity, a used coffee cup from Aunt Brenda. I felt like a criminal in my own house, slipping into rooms I wasn't supposed to enter, my heart hammering against my ribs every time a floorboard creaked. The first envelope arrived 3 weeks ago. I had sent the samples to a private third-party lab under a pseudonym. I didn't want any trail leading back to the Mitchell Group. I remember standing in my kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the windows, as I tore open the thick white paper. I didn't need a specialist to explain the results. The probability of maternity between Sarah Mitchell and me was 0%. 0. I leaned against the counter, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. For 30 years I had called this woman mother. I had apologized for being a disappointment to her. I had shrunk myself to fit into the small space she allowed me, and she wasn't my mother at all. But the report didn't stop there. The second page showed the match for Brenda Turner. The probability that Brenda was my biological mother was 99.9%. The room went silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the seconds of a life that had been a total fabrication. I realized then that the double miracle at the hospital wasn't a miracle at all. It was a heist. Sarah had wanted the perfect child to present to my grandfather to secure her place in the company, but she had struggled with her own pregnancy. Brenda, the younger, quieter sister, had been the one to carry the Mitchell heir. They had swapped us. They had taken a newborn baby and traded her like a piece of stock to satisfy a dead man will and a living woman greed. I looked at the envelope, my fingers leaving smudges on the crisp paper. Sarah had taken Riley, the child she felt was more fitting for the Mitchell image, and left me with Brenda, who had been forced to play the role of the distant aunt for 30 years. They had lived a lie every single day, watching me grow up, watching me struggle, and never saying a word. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of cold, analytical fury. I didn't confront them, I didn't scream, I went to work. I sat at the dinner table, I watched Sarah plan the 30-year anniversary gala, knowing that she intended to use the event to officially hand over the family ring to Riley, effectively bypassing me and solidifying the theft forever. She thought I was still the dutiful daughter. She thought I was still blinded by the need for her approval. She didn't realize that the woman she had raised to be a scientist was about to use that very science to burn her world to the ground. The Mitchell estate felt different now. It was like looking at a masterpiece in a museum and suddenly noticing the tiny, jagged cracks where the original paint had been covered by a clumsy forgery. Every time I walked through the grand foyer, I didn't see a home, I saw a crime scene. I watched Sarah and Riley sitting together in the sunroom, their heads bent close as they flipped through catalogs of designer gowns for the 30-year anniversary gala. They looked so natural together, a perfect symmetry of features and shared secrets. I stood in the doorway, a ghost in my own life, holding a stack of genetic reports that felt heavier than lead. "Paige, don't just stand there like a statue," Sarah said without looking up. Her voice was sharp, a flick of a whip meant to keep me in my place. "The caterers need the final head count for the VIP lounge, and for heaven's sake do something with your hair. You look like you've been living in that lab of yours for a month." "I have been working on a very complex case, Mother," I said, the word mother tasting like ash in my mouth. "A case of hidden identity. It requires a lot of focus." Riley let out a small tinkling laugh, the kind of sound that usually made men fall over themselves to help her. "Honestly, Paige, you and your DNA, everything is a puzzle to you. Why can't you just enjoy the party? It's not every day your sister gets recognized as the future of a multi-billion-dollar company." "Sister," I repeated quietly. "Yes, it is quite the milestone." I turned and walked away before the fury behind my ribs could leak into my voice. I retreated to my sanctuary, the small, wood-paneled study that had once belonged to my grandfather Silas Mitchell. It was the only room in the house Sarah hadn't dared to redecorate. She hated this room. She said it smelled of old paper and failed ambitions, but to me, it was the only place that felt honest. In the corner sat the novelty anchor of my childhood, an antique brass microscope. It had been Silas' first tool, a heavy, magnificent instrument he had used to build the foundations of his pharmaceutical empire. He had left it to me in his will, much to Sarah's annoyance. She had wanted to sell it at an auction, calling it a piece of junk, but the old man had been specific. He had told me when I was only 7 years old that the truth is never on the surface. "You have to look deeper, Paige," he had whispered. "You have to look until your eyes ache." I sat at the desk and pulled the heavy microscope toward me. I wasn't looking at slides today, I was looking at the wooden case it sat in. I remembered Silas always being protective of the velvet-lined base. I took a small scalpel from my kit and carefully pried at the corner of the interior fabric. My breath hitched as the wood gave way, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a matchbox. Inside was a single yellowed strip of plastic. It was a hospital nursery bracelet. The edges were jagged, as if it had been cut in a hurry. I held it up to the light, my hands trembling. The ink had faded to a ghostly gray, but the serial numbers were still legible. I compared them to the ones I had seen in the hospital digital archives during my late-night hacking sessions. This bracelet didn't belong to Paige Mitchell. It belonged to the baby born to Brenda Turner on that Tuesday in August. Silas had known. My grandfather had discovered the swap years ago, and for some reason he had stayed silent, leaving me this breadcrumb to find when I was strong enough to follow it. Perhaps he feared Sarah. Perhaps he knew that a public scandal would destroy the company he loved. But he had left the truth in my hands. A soft knock at the door made me jump. I shoved the bracelet into my pocket just as Aunt Brenda walked in. She was carrying a tray with a single cup of tea. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped under the weight of a life lived in Sarah's shadow. "I thought you might be thirsty, Paige," she said softly. She didn't look at me, she looked at the microscope. There was a profound, aching sadness in her eyes that I had never understood until now. "Thank you, Brenda," I said. I used her first name intentionally. I saw her flinch, a tiny ripple of emotion crossing her face. "You look so much like him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Silas always said you had the Mitchell eyes. Sharp. Unforgiving." "Is that why Sarah hates me?" I asked, standing up. I walked toward her until we were only inches apart. I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the same lines I saw in my own mirror every morning. "Because I see things she wants to keep hidden." Brenda's hand shook, the tea slopping over the side of the china cup. "She doesn't hate you, Paige. She always been afraid of losing what she has. She's a very determined woman." "At what cost?" I pressed, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "What is a legacy worth if it built on a lie, Brenda? If you take a child from her mother just to secure a trust fund, do you ever really sleep at night?" The teacup hit the floor. It didn't shatter, it just rolled across the rug, leaving a dark, spreading stain. Brenda looked at me, her face turning a ghastly shade of white. For a second I thought she was going to scream. I thought she was going to confess everything right there in the dust of the old study. "I have to go," she gasped, turning and fleeing the room. I stood in the silence, watching the door swing shut. The pressure was building, a physical force that made the air in the house feel thin. Sarah was upstairs preparing to crown a thief. Brenda was in the hallway, drowning in 30 years of guilt. And I was in the center of it all, the genetic counselor who finally had all the data points. The gala was 48 hours away. Sarah had invited the local press, the board of directors, and the most powerful lawyers in the state. She wanted a perfect evening to cement Riley's place as the heir. She thought she was in control of the narrative. She didn't realize that I had already rewritten the ending. I went back to the microscope and looked through the lens at nothing. The world was blurry, out of focus. But as I turned the silver dial, the image sharpened. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I wasn't an aunt's secret. I was the Mitchell heir, and I was about to perform the most public dissection in the history of this family. Before I take you to that stage, stay with me. Because the next part of this story isn't about science. It's about a mother greed, and the moment the blood finally speaks for itself. The 24 hours before the gala were a blur of white lilies and high-tension wires. The Mitchell estate had been invaded by a small army of caterers, florists, and security detail. Sarah was in her element, presiding over the chaos like a general preparing for a final decisive battle. She spent 3 hours arguing with the lighting technician about the exact temperature of the spotlights that would hit the stage when she handed the sapphire ring to Riley. She wanted the blue of the stone to look like a piece of the sky. She wanted the world to see a legacy being passed down through pure, untainted blood. I watched her from the balcony of the second floor. She looked so elegant, her movements fluid and commanding. I wondered if she ever felt a twinge of guilt when she looked at me. I wondered if, in the quiet moments before she fell asleep, she remembered the weight of 2 different infants in her arms 30 years ago. But as I watched her laugh with the event planner, I realized that Sarah didn't have room for guilt. She only had room for the Mitchell name, and she had spent 3 decades pruning me out of the family tree like a diseased branch. Riley found me there, leaning against the cold stone railing. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair already pinned up in elaborate gold clips. She looked like a princess preparing for her coronation. She held up her left hand, the empty space on her ring finger waiting for the sapphire. "Don't look so miserable, Paige," Riley said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll still have your job at the lab. You'll still be a Mitchell in name. It's just that the responsibility of the leadership, a burden you were never meant to carry. You're a scientist. You belong with your slides and your sequences." "You're right, Riley," I said, turning to face her. I kept my voice flat, devoid of the anger that was clawing at my throat. "I do belong with the sequences. They have a way of revealing things that people try very hard to hide." Riley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means that the truth doesn't care about a crown," I replied. "It only cares about the code." I walked past her and went straight to the library. I had requested a meeting with Mr. Lawson, the family estate lawyer. He had served the Mitchells for 40 years, a man of leather-bound law books and impenetrable silence. He was sitting at my grandfather's desk, reviewing the final transfer documents for the trust fund. "Mr. Lawson," I said, closing the door behind me, "I need to confirm the wording of the direct lineage clause in my grandfather's will. One last time." He peered at me over his gold-rimmed spectacles. "It is quite clear, Paige. The primary assets and the controlling interest in the Mitchell Group must pass to the eldest biological offspring of Silas' firstborn. That would be you, provided the biological connection is undisputed." And if it is disputed, I asked. Slauson sighed, a dry, papery sound. Then the entire trust is frozen until a forensic audit of the lineage is completed. But Sarah has already provided the birth certificates from Mitchell General. The records are sealed and authenticated. There is no reason to doubt the line. I leaned over the desk, placing the yellowed hospital bracelet I had found in the microscope case directly on top of the legal papers. The faded serial numbers looked like a death warrant against the white bond paper. This is a nursery bracelet from the day I was born, I said. It doesn't match the serial number on the certificate Sarah gave you. It matches the one in Brenda private files. Slauson froze. He didn't pick up the bracelet. He just stared at it, his face turning a waxy translucent gray. He knew what it meant. He had been there 30 years ago. He had processed the paperwork for the double miracle. Paige, he whispered, his voice trembling. Some secrets are better left in the dark. The company is stable. Riley is popular with the board. If you do this, you will destroy the Mitchell name. The Mitchell name is already destroyed, Mr. Lawson, I said. It was destroyed the moment Sarah decided that a trust fund was worth more than her sister child. I'm not looking for stability. I'm looking for my mother. I left him sitting there in the silence of the library and went to my own room. I spent the rest of the night finalizing the digital presentation I had prepared. I didn't make a slideshow of family photos. I created a map. A map of mitochondrial DNA markers, of chromosomal overlaps, and of the undeniable physical evidence of a swap. I uploaded the files to the Gala main server, bypassing the security protocols I had helped design. The turn happened at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting by the window, watching the moonlight hit the laboratory towers in the distance. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I can't do it anymore, Paige. Meet me at the boathouse, now. I knew it was Brenda. I threw on a coat and slipped out the back door, moving through the shadows of the manicured gardens. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and coming rain. The boathouse was a dark silhouette against the black water of the lake. Inside, Brenda was sitting on a wooden bench, her face buried in her hands. She looked broken, a woman who had spent 30 years carrying a mountain on her chest. I saw you in the study, she said, her voice cracked with suppressed tears. I saw you with the microscope. Silas told me he would leave a trail for you. He hated what Sarah did, but he was too proud to let the world know he had raised a monster. Tell me the truth, Brenda, I said, standing in the doorway. Tell me exactly how it happened. She told me I was too weak, Brenda sobbed, finally looking up. Her eyes were red and hollow. She said that if I kept you, we would both be poor. She said that Riley would have a better life as a Mitchell heir, and that you would be safe with her. She threatened to tell the board I was unstable. She forced me to sign the papers while I was still drugged from the delivery. I've watched you every day for 30 years, Paige. I've watched you look at me like I was just a stranger, and it has killed me a little more every hour. I'm not a stranger, Brenda, I said, the words feeling heavy and strange in my mouth. I'm your daughter. We stood there in the dark for a long time, the only sound the lapping of the water against the pilings. I didn't hug her. I couldn't. Not yet. The 30 years of distance were still a physical wall between us. But the fragile daughter Sarah thought she had raised was gone. The turn was complete. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was an investigator closing in on a target. I walked back to the house as the first light of dawn began to gray the sky. The gala was only 12 hours away. Sarah was upstairs, sleeping the sleep of the innocent, dreaming of the sapphire ring. She had no idea that the light she had requested for the stage wasn't going to show off a gem. It was going to act as a forensic lamp, revealing the bloodstains on her perfect life. The ballroom of the Mitchell Plaza was a sea of navy blue silk and sparkling crystal, illuminated by the exact shade of cool sapphire light that Sarah had obsessed over for months. 300 guests, the most powerful figures in the American pharmaceutical industry, moved through the space like characters in a silent film. The air was thick with the scent of white orchids and the quiet, rhythmic clinking of silver against china. From my position at a small table near the back, I felt like an observer watching a play where everyone but me had forgotten their lines. Sarah was the center of the universe. She stood on the raised dais, wearing a gown of midnight velvet that made her look like a queen from another era. Beside her, Riley was a vision of youthful perfection, her golden hair caught in the glare of the spotlights. They were the Mitchell image incarnate, elegant, composed, and utterly untouchable. Every time Sarah leaned in to whisper to Riley, the cameras flashed, capturing a mother love that had been manufactured in a laboratory of lies. And now, Sarah's voice rang out through the speakers, clear and commanding. We come to the moment that my father, Silas Mitchell, dreamed of since the day this company was founded. A legacy is not just about patents and profits. It is about the continuity of the bloodline. It is about the hand that carries the torch into the future. The room went silent. A waiter in a white tuxedo stepped onto the stage, carrying a small velvet cushion. Resting in the center was the Mitchell sapphire. A ring that had belonged to my grandmother, a stone so deep it looked like a trapped piece of the ocean. Riley Mitchell, Sarah said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. As the eldest biological daughter of the Mitchell line, you are the guardian of our future. I present this to you, and with it the controlling interest of the Mitchell group. Riley stepped forward, her hand extended, a triumphant smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. She looked toward me for one brief second, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the final kill. Stop, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, it cut through the air like a gunshot. I stood up, my chair scraping against the marble floor with a harsh, discordant sound. I didn't rush. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking a steady rhythm. I saw Aunt Brenda, my mother, standing in the wings, her face buried in a handkerchief. I saw Mr. Lawson, the lawyer, clutching his briefcase so hard his knuckles were white. Paige, sit down, Sarah hissed as I reached the edge of the stage. Her eyes were twin daggers of ice. Do not do this. You are making a fool of yourself in front of the entire board. I'm not the one making a fool of the board, Sarah, I replied, stepping onto the dais. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years pretending I was a stranger. I'm the one ending the charade. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small remote I had taken from the tech booth. With a single click, the massive LED screens behind the stage, the ones meant to show a montage of Riley's life, flickered and changed. A massive genetic map appeared. It was a comparative analysis, color-coded and simplified for a general audience. 2 columns of markers, glowing in sharp clinical white against a black background. What is this nonsense? Riley shouted, her voice high and brittle. Security, get her off the stage. The security guards moved forward, but they stopped when the first set of words appeared on the screen in bold letters. DNA analysis. Mitchell direct lineage. My father believed in precision, I said, turning to the audience. He believed that the truth was written in our cells. So I decided to read it. What you see on the screen is a direct comparison between Sarah Mitchell and the 2 children born on that Tuesday 30 years ago. I clicked the remote again. The left column labeled Riley began to glow red. A large, flashing 0% appeared next to Sarah's name. Riley Mitchell is not the biological daughter of Sarah Mitchell, I announced, my voice steady as a surgeon hand. She is the daughter of Brenda Turner. She was taken from her mother's arms 30 years ago to play a role in a trust fund heist. The ballroom erupted into a chaos of whispers and gasps. I saw the board members standing up, their faces pale with shock. Sarah lunged for me, her fingers clawing at my arm, but I stepped back, my eyes fixed on the screen. And this, I said, clicking the remote a final time. The right column labeled PAIGE began to glow a brilliant neon blue. The markers aligned perfectly. Every chromosome, every genetic signature, locked into place like a key in a vault. Maternity probability. 99.9%. I am the biological daughter of Sarah Mitchell, I said, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting this to the world. I am the child she rejected because I didn't fit her vision of a Mitchell heir. She gave me away to her sister like a piece of unwanted equipment, and she stole Riley to be her puppet. She traded her own flesh and blood for a seat at the head of a table. Sarah's face didn't break. It didn't soften. It twisted into something monstrous. She didn't look like a mother, she looked like a predator that had finally been cornered. You think this matters? Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the hall. You think these people care about a few drops of blood? I built this. I am the Mitchell Group. You are nothing but a lab rat, Paige. You have no charm, no presence, no future. I have the truth, Sarah, I said, and according to the direct lineage clause in Silas Mitchell will, I have the company. Mr. Lawson stepped onto the stage then, his hands shaking as he held up a legal document. She is correct, Sarah. I have reviewed the forensic evidence in the original hospital records. The fraud is undeniable. Under the terms of the trust, your authority is hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation into the kidnapping and identity theft. Riley began to cry then. Not the soft, elegant tears of a victim, but the harsh, ugly wailing of a spoiled child who had just lost her favorite toy. She looked at Sarah, reaching out for comfort, but Sarah didn't even look at her. Sarah only looked at the ring, the sapphire she had lost. I walked over to the velvet cushion. I didn't pick up the ring. I looked at it, the blue stone cold and distant. I realized then that I didn't want it. I didn't want to be the queen of a glass castle built on the misery of 2 stolen children. Take them out, I told the security guards. They moved with a sudden heavy efficiency. As Sarah was led away, she passed Aunt Brenda. For a second, the 2 sisters looked at each other, the one who had stolen and the one who had allowed herself to be robbed. No words were spoken. They were 2 sides of the same tragic coin. The ballroom was still a storm of noise, but as I stood on that stage, I felt a strange, hollow quiet. I looked at the DNA map on the screen, the blue markers glowing like stars. For 30 years, I had searched for the reason why I didn't belong. Now I knew. It wasn't because I was broken. It was because I was the only thing in this family that was real. The fallout from the gala was a tidal wave that swept through the Mitchell group and the city elite circles for months. Sarah was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. She fought the charges with a cold, jagged ferocity, hiring the most expensive legal team in the state, but even the best lawyers couldn't argue with a genetic map. She was eventually sentenced to 10 years in a federal facility. Even on the day she was led away, she didn't look at me with regret. She looked at me as if I were a failed experiment that had finally ruined her laboratory. Riley was stripped of her title and her access to the Mitchell fortune. She didn't go to prison, but she was forced to move into the small cottage on the edge of the estate with the woman she had spent her life treating as a servant. Watching her try to navigate a world without a silver spoon was a slow, painful lesson in humility. She still looks at me with a mixture of fear and resentment, but I no longer feel the need to apologize for existing. I spent the first 6 months after the trial using my legal authority as the rightful heir to dismantle the Mitchell Trust. I didn't want to be the CEO of a pharmaceutical giant, I wanted to be a scientist. I worked with the board of directors to turn the company into a transparent, employee-owned organization, and I shifted the focus of our research toward genetic advocacy for marginalized families. I kept enough of the inheritance to ensure Brenda was cared for, and then I donated the rest to a foundation for victims of medical and family fraud. Brenda and I are still learning how to be mother and daughter. It is not a fairy tale ending. You cannot erase 30 years of silence with a few months of conversation. Sometimes we sit on the porch of her new house, and the quiet between us feels heavy, like a bridge that is still being built. But she is trying. She brings me tea without trembling now, and occasionally she tells me stories about the week I was born. The week I was actually hers. I moved out of the grand estate and bought a small sun-filled house near the university. In my new study there is no velvet or marble. There is just a long oak desk and a wall of books. In the center of the room sits the antique brass microscope Silas left for me. I still look through its lens every morning. It reminds me that while the surface of a person can be polished to a mirror shine, the truth is always there, waiting in the deep, quiet layers. I never wore the sapphire ring. I had it placed in a museum exhibit about the history of the Mitchell family, a beautiful stone with a dark, complicated past. It belongs behind glass, where it can be observed but never again used to buy a human soul. I am no longer the girl who lived in the shadows of a glass house. I am Paige Mitchell. A name that finally belongs to me because I earned it with the truth. I have learned that family isn't about whose name is on the birth certificate or who wears the heirloom ring. It is about the people who see you, even when you are trying to be invisible. If you have ever felt like you were living someone else's life, or if you've been told that your worth is tied to a legacy you never asked for, I want you to remember this. Your blood is a map, but it is not your destination. You have the power to draw your own lines. You have the power to say who you are. If this story helped you feel a little more grounded in your own truth, please leave a comment below and share your journey with us. I read every word, and I am honored to be part of your story. Please like and subscribe to help us bring more truths into the light. Until next time, keep looking deeper. The truth is always there, just waiting for you to find it.